To Evelyn, who finally understands when it's time to step aside and let the younger generation take over, my daughter-in-law Vanessa said with a polished smile as she lifted her champagne glass in the middle of my grandson's 10th birthday lunch, and for a moment, the entire private dining room at the Oak Ridge Country Club went silent. Not completely silent. There were still the soft clinks of silverware against china plates, the distant sound of a piano near the lobby, and the nervous little laugh someone let out near the end of the table. But the kind of silence that matters most had already settled over everyone there. The silence of people realizing something cruel had just happened and deciding not to stop it. I smiled anyway. At 68 years old, I had learned that humiliation often arrives wearing pearls and speaking softly. Well, I said lightly, lifting my iced tea instead of champagne. I suppose every family has to make room eventually. Vanessa's smile widened just slightly. She had won that round, and she knew it. Around the table, the guests relaxed again. Conversations slowly resumed. My son Daniel chuckled under his breath and reached for his wine glass as though nothing unusual had happened. That hurt more than Vanessa's toast ever could. Because Vanessa was not my blood. Daniel was. The lunch had started beautifully, which somehow made the moment even worse. The country club ballroom overlooked a golf course so perfectly maintained it looked painted onto the landscape. Bright June sunlight spilled through the tall windows. White hydrangeas decorated every table. Mason had wanted a baseball-themed birthday, but Vanessa insisted on something more elegant. That was always her way. Everything had to look polished, refined, Instagram-worthy, even childhood birthdays, especially family gatherings. I had arrived 40 minutes early carrying Mason's presents myself because Daniel said the valet area would be too chaotic later in the afternoon. I didn't mind. I used to love arriving early to family events back when my husband Walter was alive. He always said I moved through parties like I belonged there. Back then I did. But that morning, the first thing I noticed was my seat assignment. Not beside Daniel. Not beside Mason. Not even near the center of the long table where family traditionally sat. My name card had been placed near the far end beside the children's section between two folding booster seats and directly across from the craft station where toddlers were decorating cupcakes. At first, I honestly thought it was a mistake. Vanessa noticed me staring at the card almost immediately. "Oh good," she said brightly as she adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored dress. "You found your spot. I figured you'd be more comfortable down there since you always say you love watching the kids." Comfortable. That word stayed with me all afternoon. Comfortable meant out of the way. Comfortable meant invisible. I told myself not to overthink it. Families changed. Traditions changed. Younger people hosted events differently these days. I had repeated those excuses to myself for years now. Ever since Vanessa entered our family with her polished manners and careful little smiles that never quite reached her eyes. The servers brought grilled salmon, roasted asparagus, and tiny bowls of truffle mashed potatoes. Mason opened gifts while Vanessa narrated every moment loudly enough for the room to hear. "Say thank you properly, sweetheart. Don't wrinkle the wrapping paper. Smile for the picture." By the time dessert arrived, my head already ached from pretending not to notice all the small exclusions. Family photos where no one called me over. Conversations that stopped when I approached. Stories about vacations I hadn't been invited to. Then came the toast. Vanessa stood gracefully, tapping her spoon lightly against the champagne glass. "Before Mason blows out the candles," she announced warmly, "I just wanted to say how wonderful it is seeing generations gathered together like this." People smiled politely. Daniel nodded proudly beside her. "And I especially want to thank Evelyn," she continued, turning toward me, "for always supporting this family and for finally understanding when it's time to step aside and let the younger generation take over." A few people laughed softly, uncertain whether it was meant as a joke. Vanessa laughed too. Daniel did not correct her. He did not look embarrassed. He simply stared down into his wine glass with the same uncomfortable half-smile he'd worn more and more often these past few years whenever Vanessa said something cruel disguised as humor. I felt every eye at the table flick toward me for just a second. Waiting, watching, measuring my reaction. I kept smiling because women my age learn early that public dignity is sometimes the only thing nobody can take from you. But beneath the tablecloth, my hands trembled so badly I had to press them against my knees to keep anyone from noticing. Mason leaned toward me then, innocent and cheerful. "Grandma." he whispered loudly. Mom says when people get older, they usually move somewhere smaller so younger families can have the big houses. I turned slowly toward him. His blue eyes looked exactly like Daniel's had at that age. Open, honest, completely unaware he had just repeated something he'd heard many times before. Vanessa reached over quickly and brushed frosting from his cheek. Mason, she said with a soft laugh, that's not polite dinner conversation. But she was smiling when she said it, smiling directly at me. And in that moment, sitting at the far end of my grandson's birthday table, while sunlight poured across the polished silverware and everyone pretended not to notice what was happening, I realized something cold and terrible. This had not been a careless joke. It had not been one awkward comment. They had been preparing for my disappearance for a very long time. I drove home from the country club with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The June heat shimmered above the highway, and for a few moments I could not remember turning onto my own street. My mind kept replaying Mason's small voice at the table. Mom says when people get older, they usually move somewhere smaller. Children repeat what they hear. That was the frightening part. Nobody had corrected him because nobody thought there was anything wrong with the idea. My house stood exactly as Walter and I had left it years ago. White shutters, stone walkway, the climbing roses I still trimmed every Saturday morning. We bought the place in 1987 after Walter received his promotion at the insurance firm downtown. Back then, Daniel was only 11 years old and spent entire summers riding his bicycle in circles across the driveway while I watched from the kitchen window. For years, this house had been loud with life. Christmas music in December. Football games every Thanksgiving. Walter asleep in his leather chair with the newspaper folded across his chest. Now the silence felt different. Not peaceful. Watchful somehow. I placed Mason's unopened baseball card organizer on the kitchen counter because Vanessa had announced at the party that they already bought him something much nicer. She had smiled sweetly when she said it, but I noticed she never actually let him open my gift. The refrigerator hummed softly as I poured myself a glass of water. My reflection stared back at me from the dark microwave door. Silver hair carefully styled. Pearl earrings. Pale blue blouse still perfectly pressed. From the outside, I looked composed. Respectable. Like a woman with a beautiful family and a comfortable life. That was the strange thing about humiliation. Most of the time, nobody else could see it. They only saw the surface. I walked slowly through the living room, straightening things that did not need straightening. One of Walter's habits had become mine after he passed 3 years earlier. Whenever life became painful, he used to organize something. Fold newspapers, polish his glasses, rearrange bookshelves. Small acts of control against larger fears. I stopped near the fireplace where framed family photographs lined the mantel. At first glance, everything looked normal. Birthdays, graduations, vacations, smiling faces under bright American sunshine. But once I started really looking, I noticed something unsettling. Over the past few years, I appeared less and less often. In older photographs, I stood at the center beside Walter. In newer ones, I was pushed toward the edges. Sometimes entirely absent. Last Christmas, Vanessa posted 23 photos online from their holiday dinner. I was only visible in one picture, blurred in the background carrying a casserole dish into the dining room. I remembered how she laughed afterward and said, "Oh, Evelyn, you disappeared before we could get the good family shots." At the time, I believed her. Or maybe I simply wanted to. I sat down carefully in Walter's old recliner and stared at the grandfather clock near the staircase. For 32 in the afternoon. Daniel had not called after the lunch. Neither had Mason. A few years ago, Daniel always called after family events to make sure I got home safely. That stopped gradually after Vanessa entered his life. Not suddenly. Slowly. Like watching daylight fade through winter windows. I remembered the first Thanksgiving after their wedding. Vanessa insisted they host instead of me because she wanted to start modern traditions. I spent 6 hours cooking side dishes anyway because Daniel said everyone still loved my recipes. When I arrived, Vanessa had already ordered catered food from an upscale restaurant downtown. My casserole stayed untouched beside the kitchen sink all evening. "People do lighter meals these days," she whispered kindly while guests filled their plates with catered salmon and roasted vegetables. I drove home that night with full containers balanced on the passenger seat beside me. The following year, she forgot to include me in the family gift exchange. The year after that, she booked a ski trip during my birthday weekend. Every incident had its own explanation. its own polite excuse. Individually, they seemed small. Together, they formed something colder, more deliberate. I closed my eyes and leaned back against Walter's chair. For the first time since his funeral, a thought settled into my mind that I could no longer push away. Vanessa was not simply trying to hurt my feelings. She was slowly removing me from my own family, piece by piece, until eventually nobody would question my absence at all. 3 days passed before Daniel finally called me, and even then, it was only because Mason wanted to thank me for the birthday check. I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing coffee grounds from the pot when the phone rang. Daniel's name lit up the screen, and for one foolish second my heart lifted the way it used to. Years ago. "Hey Mom," he said casually, the sound of traffic humming somewhere in the background. "Sorry, we have been busy since the party." Busy. Such a harmless little word. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel and told him it was fine. Mason came onto the line afterward, cheerful and distracted, talking mostly about the new gaming system Vanessa and Daniel had bought him. "Mom says we might move to a bigger house soon," he added excitedly. "One with a pool and a movie room." I leaned against the counter. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart." "Yeah," he continued happily. "Mom says Grandpa's house is big enough already, but old people houses smell weird after a while." There was a burst of laughter in the background. Adult laughter. Then Daniel's voice quickly returned. "Okay, buddy, give me the phone." Mason disappeared from the line. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. Kids repeat nonsense sometimes. You know how they are. I stared through the kitchen window, toward the backyard, where Walter used to mow every Sunday morning in neat straight lines. "Yes," I said quietly. "They usually repeat what they hear at home." Daniel did not answer right away. For a moment, all I heard was the low hum of conversation around him. Then Vanessa's voice floated faintly through the receiver. "Ask her if she got the brochure." Daniel lowered his voice immediately after that. "Mom, did something arrive at your house yesterday? Maybe from Cedar Grove." My stomach tightened before I even understood why. "No," I answered carefully. "What is Cedar Grove?" "Nothing serious," he said too quickly. "Just information. Vanessa thought maybe you would enjoy looking at some retirement communities eventually. Strictly for the future." Retirement communities. The words landed softly but carried enormous weight. I walked slowly toward the dining room table and sat down because suddenly my knees felt unsteady. "I see," I said. "You are 68 now." Daniel continued in that patient tone people use when pretending concern. "You live alone in a pretty large house. We just worry about you, that is all." Worry. Another polite word hiding something uglier underneath. I looked around the dining room Walter and I had restored together room by room over 20 years. The oak cabinets he refinished himself. The chandelier we bought in Charleston during our 25th anniversary trip. The long table that once seated 12 people every Christmas Eve. This house was not simply property. It was evidence of an entire life. "I am managing just fine," I replied calmly. Daniel sighed softly. "Nobody is saying you are not. We are only thinking ahead." Thinking ahead. That phrase echoed in my mind long after the call ended. That evening I opened my mailbox and found a large cream-colored envelope resting inside. Cedar Grove Senior Living Community. Elegant, independent lifestyle options for active adults. I carried it into the kitchen without opening it immediately. The brochure showed smiling gray-haired couples drinking wine beside a lake, while younger staff members leaned over them supportively. Everyone looked healthy, wealthy, carefully photographed. I turned pages slowly. Weekly transportation, medication assistance, chef-prepared meals, simplified living. Beneath one photograph, a sentence printed in gold lettering caught my eye. "Because your family deserves peace of mind." I closed the brochure quietly and stared at my reflection in the dark window above the sink. Outside, the evening sky faded into deep blue over the backyard Walter had planted with maple trees decades ago. Peace of mind for whom? Certainly not for me. For the first time, a terrible possibility settled fully into place inside my chest. Vanessa was not merely pushing me toward the edges of family gatherings anymore. She was preparing a future where I no longer lived in the center of my own life at all. The following Friday, I saw Daniel's car parked outside a real estate office downtown. I almost drove past without thinking much about it at first. Realtors had become part of his social world over the years. Country club dinners, investment properties, charity galas with people who always seemed to be renovating kitchens or buying vacation homes in Arizona. But then I noticed Vanessa standing beside him through the glass window, pointing toward a set of blueprints spread across a polished conference table. Something about the way they leaned close together made my chest tighten. I parked across the street beside a pharmacy and sat there for several moments with the air conditioning running softly against my face. I told myself I was being paranoid. Suspicious. Old people became suspicious sometimes when they spent too much time alone. That was exactly the kind of thing Vanessa would say. Still, I could not make myself drive away. Through the wide office windows, I watched Vanessa gesture animatedly, while a sharply dressed realtor nodded and smiled. Daniel looked tired more than excited. He rubbed the back of his neck the same way Walter used to whenever stress started settling into his shoulders. After nearly 20 minutes, the meeting ended. The realtor shook their hands warmly and walked them toward the door. I turned slightly in my seat as they stepped onto the sidewalk. Vanessa laughed at something the realtor said. Daniel glanced down at his phone. Then, just before they reached their car, the realtor handed Vanessa a folder thick with paperwork. I could not hear most of the conversation over the traffic passing between us, but one sentence drifted clearly through the open summer air. Once the property transfers, the value will increase substantially after renovation. Property transfers. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Vanessa nodded confidently. That is exactly what we are planning. They drove away a few moments later without noticing my car parked half a block down the street. I remained there long after they disappeared into traffic. The pharmacy sign buzzed faintly overhead while shoppers pushed carts through the parking lot around me. Ordinary Friday afternoon life continued as though nothing important had happened. Yet inside my chest, something had shifted permanently. Until that moment, part of me still wanted to believe all of this came from misplaced concern. Maybe Vanessa truly thought retirement communities were safer. Maybe Daniel simply felt overwhelmed balancing work, children, and a widowed mother living alone. But people discussing renovations and property transfers were not talking about emotional support. They were discussing assets, investments, future ownership. I drove home slowly through neighborhoods Walter and I once dreamed of moving into when we were younger. Bigger homes, newer kitchens, swimming pools behind iron gates. We eventually chose to stay in our old house because Walter said something once that never left me. A home becomes valuable because of the life inside it, not because of what somebody else would pay for it. I repeated those words quietly to myself as I pulled into my driveway. The maple trees cast long shadows across the lawn. My porch swing moved gently in the warm evening breeze. Everything looked peaceful, steady, mine. Inside the house, I walked directly to Walter's old office upstairs. I had barely entered that room since his funeral. The scent of cedar and old paper still lingered faintly in the air. His desk remained exactly as he left it. Neatly arranged pens, reading glasses folded beside a yellow legal pad, framed photographs facing outward toward the empty chair. I opened the bottom desk drawer searching for nothing specific at first, perhaps only comfort, familiarity. But beneath several old insurance files and tax folders, my hand brushed against a small brass key taped underneath the drawer lining. I froze. Walter had always hidden important things carefully. Slowly, I peeled the tape away and turned the tiny key over in my palm. Immediately, I knew what it belonged to. The safe deposit box at First National Bank downtown. One we had not opened together in years. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly somewhere beyond the trees as evening clouds gathered over the neighborhood. I sat alone in Walter's office with the little brass key resting cold against my skin, and for the first time since Vanessa entered my family, I began to suspect my husband may have seen this coming long before I ever did. The next morning, I drove downtown just after 9 o'clock with Walter's brass key resting inside my purse beside my reading glasses and house keys. Rain from the night before still clung to the sidewalks, and the city looked washed clean under the pale morning sunlight. First National Bank had not changed much in 30 years. The marble floors still echoed softly beneath footsteps. The same brass lamps still glowed behind the teller counters. Walter trusted places that survived changing times without trying too hard to appear modern. Institutions should feel steady, he used to say, not trendy. The young man at the front desk smiled politely when I gave him my identification and safe deposit information. A few minutes later, a gray-haired bank manager named Linda escorted me downstairs to the private vault rooms. Take all the time you need, Mrs. Carter, she said gently before leaving me alone at the small wooden table with the metal lockbox resting in front of me. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Walter and I opened this box together so many times throughout our marriage. Insurance papers, property records, Daniel's college savings bonds. Important pieces of an ordinary American life carefully preserved behind steel doors. My hands trembled slightly as I slid the key into the lock. Inside sat several folders arranged with Walter's usual precision. Tax records, old deeds, investment statements. But beneath everything else rested a sealed cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in Walter's unmistakable handwriting. Evelyn, only if you truly need this. I stopped breathing for a moment. Slowly, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, something has already begun to feel wrong around you. I know you. You would never open this unless your instincts finally forced you to. First, let me say something clearly. This house belongs to you. Not morally, not emotionally, legally, completely. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Beneath the letter rested copies of trust documents I barely remembered signing years ago during one of Walter's estate planning meetings. At the time, I trusted him completely and paid little attention to legal details. Walter always handled paperwork while I handled people. But now, sitting alone inside the quiet bank vault, I began reading every line carefully. The house had been placed into a protected family trust nearly 8 years earlier. Ownership transferred fully to me upon Walter's death. Daniel would inherit only after my passing and only under specific conditions. One paragraph near the bottom made my chest tighten. Any attempt to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence Evelyn Carter regarding the sale or transfer of residential property shall immediately suspend inheritance distribution pending independent legal review. I lowered the papers slowly onto the table. Walter knew. Somehow, years before his heart attack, my husband had already prepared for the possibility that someone might one day try convincing me to surrender my own home. Tears blurred my vision then, but not the helpless kind I had cried after his funeral. These tears came from something deeper. Recognition, protection, love reaching across death itself. I continued reading the letter. You always see the best in people, Evelyn. That is one of the reasons I loved you from the moment I met you. But kindness sometimes attracts those who mistake gentleness for weakness. If Daniel ever forgets where he came from, do not sacrifice yourself to protect him from the consequences of that failure. I pressed my hand against my mouth. Walter rarely spoke harshly about anyone, especially our son. Yet every word on that page carried quiet certainty. At the bottom of the envelope sat one final item. A business card for an attorney named Harold Bennett with a note written beneath it in Walter's handwriting. Harold knows everything. Trust him before you trust anyone else. Upstairs, faint sounds of the busy bank filtered through the ceiling. Phones ringing. Doors opening. Ordinary people handling ordinary lives. Meanwhile, I sat alone beneath the city holding proof that my husband had spent years protecting me from a danger I never believed could come from my own family. And for the first time since Mason's birthday lunch, the fear inside me began slowly transforming into something colder. Clarity. Something inside me changed after reading Walter's letter. Not dramatically. I did not slam doors or call Daniel in tears demanding explanations. Real change rarely arrives that way at my age. Instead, it settled quietly into the spaces where fear used to live. The following week, I stopped saying yes to everything. That was the first thing Vanessa noticed. Every Wednesday for nearly 4 years, I picked up Mason and Olivia from school because Vanessa claimed her Pilates classes ran late. I used to drive 20 minutes across town, sit through traffic, and bring the children back to my house for snacks and homework until Daniel arrived after work. The next Wednesday, Vanessa called at 2:15 in the afternoon while I was pruning roses in the backyard. Evelyn, she said brightly, I might be 15 minutes late for pickup today. Could you leave a little earlier than usual? I clipped another rose carefully before answering. I will not be able to help today. Silence. Just a second of it. But enough. Oh, she said finally. Are you sick? No. I simply have plans. My plans consisted of drinking iced tea on my own porch while reading a mystery novel I had abandoned halfway through 6 months earlier. Vanessa laughed lightly into the phone, though something strained hid underneath the sound. Well, I really do not know what we are supposed to do now. We. Interesting word. As though their childcare arrangements somehow belong to me too. I am sure you will figure something out, I replied gently. That evening Daniel called sounding exhausted. Mom, Vanessa had to cancel an appointment because of today. I see. You usually help with the kids. Usually. Another dangerous word. I looked around my quiet living room where late sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors. Walter installed himself 20 years ago. Yes, I answered calmly. Usually I do. Daniel sighed heavily into the phone. What is going on lately? The strange thing was I almost laughed. Because for the first time in years, nothing was going on with me. I was simply stepping backward and allowing them to feel the weight of responsibilities I had been quietly carrying for them all along. A few days later, Vanessa invited herself over unexpectedly just before dinner. She arrived wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying the kind of expensive grocery store flowers people buy when they want to appear thoughtful without investing real effort. I was in the neighborhood, she explained as she placed the flowers on my kitchen counter. She looked around carefully while speaking, her eyes lingering briefly on the staircase and dining room as though mentally measuring something. The house still feels very large for one person, she added casually. I poured coffee into 2 cups without responding immediately. It feels exactly the same size it always has. Vanessa smiled politely. Of course, I only mean maintenance must become overwhelming sometimes. There it was again, the performance of concern, the soft language hiding sharper intentions underneath. She accepted the coffee and sat across from me at the kitchen table where Walter used to read newspapers every morning before work. Daniel worries about you, she continued carefully. We both do. I stirred cream slowly into my cup. How fortunate for me. Vanessa's smile tightened slightly. She was not accustomed to resistance delivered quietly. You know, she said after a moment, there are beautiful retirement communities now. Some feel more like resorts. So I have heard. And honestly, with the current housing market, your property alone could set you up somewhere incredible. Property, not home, not memories, not Walter's roses blooming outside the window. Property. I looked directly at her then, really looked at her for perhaps the first time since she married my son. Her blonde hair perfectly highlighted, diamond bracelet glimmering against her wrist, careful makeup, polished manners. Everything about Vanessa projected warmth until you noticed how cold her eyes became whenever money entered a conversation. She mistook my silence for uncertainty and leaned forward slightly. You deserve to relax now, Evelyn. I smiled softly over the rim of my coffee cup. You know, I said, Walter used to tell me that people reveal themselves most clearly when they start discussing things they believe already belong to them. Vanessa froze for just a fraction of a second before laughing lightly again. But this time, the sound did not reach her eyes at all. 2 days after Vanessa's visit, Daniel invited me to dinner at their house for the first time. In nearly 3 months. The invitation arrived by text message at exactly 8:12 in the morning. Mom, we should all have dinner together Friday night. Just family. Vanessa wants to clear the air. I stared at the message while standing in my kitchen beside the toaster. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows over the sink. Just family. Strange phrase considering how carefully they had spent years making me feel separate from it. Still, I agreed to come. By Friday evening, the rain had cleared and the entire neighborhood smelled faintly of wet grass and blooming jasmine. Vanessa greeted me at the front door wearing a cream-colored sweater and the same careful smile she used whenever other people were watching. Evelyn, she said warmly, leaning in for an air kiss near my cheek. You look wonderful. Behind her, I noticed the dining room table had been set with expensive candles and polished wine glasses. Too formal for an ordinary family dinner. Daniel emerged from the kitchen carrying a bottle of red wine. He looked nervous. Not guilty exactly. Tired. Like a man trying desperately to keep 2 worlds from colliding. Mason and Olivia barely stayed at the table before Vanessa encouraged them upstairs to watch a movie. The moment the children disappeared, the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Softer, heavier, purposeful. Vanessa folded her napkin carefully onto her lap. We have all been under stress lately, she began gently. And I think misunderstandings may have created unnecessary tension. I cut a small piece of chicken slowly before answering. What misunderstanding would that be? Daniel cleared his throat. Mom, nobody is trying to upset you. Of course not. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. We only want what is best for everyone long term. There it was again. Long term. Future planning. The language people use when discussing investments instead of human beings. Dinner continued politely enough after that. Vanessa complimented my earrings. Daniel talked about rising mortgage rates. Olivia came downstairs briefly to ask for ice cream. Everything almost resembled a normal family evening except for the tension humming quietly underneath. Every sentence. Halfway through dessert, Vanessa stood and walked toward the kitchen. She returned carrying a slim leather folder and placed it carefully beside Daniel's plate. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. Somehow, I had already known this moment was coming. Daniel opened the folder without meeting my eyes. "Mom," he said carefully, "we have been talking with a financial advisor." Vanessa sat back down beside him, her expression calm and practiced. "There are tax advantages if property transitions happen earlier rather than later," she explained smoothly, "especially with the market where it is now." Daniel slid several papers gently across the table toward me. "Nobody is asking you to leave your home," he added quickly. "This would simply streamline things legally. Protect the family's future." I looked down at the paperwork without touching it. Transfer documents. Preliminary ownership adjustments. Trust consultation recommendations. My eyes lingered on one sentence near the bottom. Proposed transfer of residential property interest. Vanessa watched my face carefully the way a realtor watches potential buyers walk through expensive homes. Measuring reaction. Calculating hesitation. "You do not have to decide tonight," she said softly. "But honestly, Evelyn, this would remove so much stress from everyone." Everyone. Interesting again how my home somehow belonged emotionally to a group discussion now. I folded my hands neatly together on the table. "Walter always handled financial paperwork," I said quietly. "I would need legal advice before signing anything." For the first time that evening, Vanessa's composure cracked slightly. Just slightly. "Lawyers complicate simple matters," she replied too quickly. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. "Mom, we are family." I looked directly at my son then. Really looked at him. The boy who once cried because he accidentally broke my favorite coffee mug at age 9. The young man who held my hand at Walter's funeral because he thought I might collapse from grief. Somewhere along the way, that version of Daniel had slowly disappeared behind polished conversations about assets and future planning. I smiled softly and closed the folder. "Exactly," I said, "which is why everybody should be properly protected." Vanessa did not touch her dessert again after that. The following Monday morning, I met Harold Bennett in an office overlooking the river downtown. Walter's attorney was older now than I remembered, his silver hair thinner and his shoulders slightly stooped beneath an expensive navy suit, but his eyes remained sharp and observant. The moment I entered his office, he stood immediately and took both my hands gently in his. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "I was wondering when you might call." Something in the way he said it made my chest tighten again. Not surprise. Expectation. Harold already knew why I was there before I ever opened my purse and removed the transfer documents Vanessa and Daniel had given me. He adjusted his glasses slowly while reading through the pages in silence. The only sound in the room came from the faint ticking of an antique clock near the bookshelf. Finally, he placed the papers carefully onto his desk and leaned back in his chair. "Your husband anticipated this possibility years ago," he said calmly. I looked toward the wide office windows where gray clouds drifted above the riverfront skyline. Did Walter think Daniel would become this person? Harold folded his hands together thoughtfully before answering. Walter believed people often reveal different sides of themselves when property and inheritance become involved. I lowered my eyes toward the documents again. Seeing the legal language there somehow hurt more than Vanessa's cruel toast ever had. Because paperwork made everything feel coldly intentional. Planned. "They wanted me to sign these during dinner," I said quietly. Harold's expression hardened slightly. "And if you had signed without legal review, they could have begun establishing partial control over future sale negotiations." I stared at him. "So they truly were trying to take the house?" "Eventually," he answered carefully. "Yes." The room felt strangely still after that. Not dramatic, just heavy with the quiet collapse of illusions I had protected for years. Harold opened a thick folder from his desk drawer and slid several documents toward me. "Walter created extensive protections inside the trust," he explained, "including one very specific clause." I began reading slowly. Any beneficiary shown to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence Evelyn Carter regarding residential property decisions may face immediate suspension of inheritance rights pending independent trustee review. I looked up sharply. Harold nodded once. Your husband was very clear about protecting your independence. For several moments, neither of us spoke. I thought about Walter sitting at our kitchen table years earlier signing these papers while I probably worried about grocery lists or holiday decorations, completely unaware he was quietly building walls around my future. Harold removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly. Evelyn, I will speak plainly. Vanessa has already contacted 2 separate real estate consultants regarding projected sale values for your property after renovation. A cold feeling settled across my shoulders. How do you know that? One of them happens to be my client. Of course. In cities like ours, professional circles overlap quietly all the time. Harold's voice softened slightly afterward. Your son may not fully understand how aggressively this situation has been developing around him. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because part of me still wanted someone else to blame besides Daniel himself. Harold continued reviewing the trust documents with me for nearly an hour. Legal safeguards, ownership structures, financial protections Walter had carefully arranged long before his death. By the end of the meeting, one thing had become painfully clear. Nobody could force me out of my home unless I allowed it. When I finally stood to leave, Harold handed the transfer documents back to me neatly sealed inside a manila folder. Do not confront them emotionally, he advised gently. People become careless when they believe they are still in control. Outside, the afternoon air felt heavy with approaching rain again. I sat inside my car overlooking the river for several minutes before starting the engine. Across the passenger seat rested the folder, containing every proof I needed. Legal proof, financial proof, the truth itself, carefully documented in signatures and clauses. Yet strangely, the thing that hurt most was not the betrayal. It was realizing how calmly Vanessa and Daniel had expected me to surrender everything while smiling politely across a dinner table. 3 weeks later, I hosted Thanksgiving dinner in my house for the first time since Walter passed away. The maple trees outside had turned deep shades of gold and amber, scattering leaves across the front lawn Walter once raked every autumn with almost military precision. Inside, the dining room glowed softly beneath candlelight reflected against polished china and crystal glasses I had not used in years. The house felt alive again. Not crowded, not loud, simply warm in the honest way homes feel when the people inside truly want to be there. Margaret came early carrying homemade pecan pie and enough gossip to fill an entire evening by herself. Harold arrived shortly afterward with his wife, Susan, who immediately disappeared into the kitchen, insisting no hostess should cook alone on Thanksgiving. Mason and Olivia sat near the fireplace playing card games while the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifted through the rooms. I watched them quietly from the doorway for several moments before realizing something important. This was the first family gathering in years where I did not feel like a tolerated guest in my own life. Daniel arrived alone 20 minutes late. I heard his car door close outside before the doorbell finally rang. When I opened the front door, he stood there holding a bottle of wine with exhaustion written across his face. He looked older somehow. The confident sharpness Vanessa encouraged in him had faded, leaving behind a man who suddenly seemed uncertain where he belonged anymore. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "I hope I am not too late." I stepped aside without answering immediately. He entered slowly, his eyes drifting around the house as though seeing it clearly for the first time in years. The old grandfather clock near the staircase. Walter's photographs above the fireplace. The dining table polished to a soft glow. Beneath candlelight. Home. Real home. "Where is Vanessa?" I asked calmly once he set the wine bottle onto the counter. Daniel looked down for a moment before speaking. "She stayed with her sister this week." I nodded once. No dramatic explanation followed. None was necessary. Some silences explained everything more clearly than words ever could. Dinner unfolded quietly after that. Not tense, not emotional, just careful. Daniel helped carry dishes to the table the way Walter taught him as a teenager. Olivia asked him to help untangle Christmas lights for next month. Mason showed Harold his baseball cards between bites of sweet potatoes. Life continued moving forward despite everything people break along the way. At one point during dessert, Daniel remained alone in the dining room, while the others drifted toward the living room coffee and conversation. I found him standing near the mantel staring at an old photograph of Walter and me taken during a beach vacation nearly 30 years earlier. "Dad loved this house," he said softly. "Yes," I answered. "He did." Daniel swallowed hard before turning toward me. I did not realize how far things had gone. The strange thing was I believed him. Not completely. Not enough to erase the damage. But enough to understand something painful. Weak people often allow stronger personalities to guide their morals slowly, one compromise at a time, until eventually they no longer recognize themselves either. He rubbed both hands together nervously before continuing. Vanessa thought downsizing made financial sense. Then everything became about market value and investments, and his voice trailed away. I looked toward Walter's photograph above the fireplace. A home cannot survive once people stop seeing each other as human beings and start seeing each other as opportunities. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. The silence between us stretched gently instead of harshly. Finally, he whispered the words I suspect had been sitting inside him for months. "I am sorry, Mom." I studied my son carefully then. Not the frightened little boy he once was. Not the distant man Vanessa shaped into something colder. Just Daniel. Flawed. Weak. Sometimes. Human. "I know," I said quietly. And surprisingly, I meant it. Later that night, after everyone left and the dishes sat drying beside the sink, I stood alone on the back porch wrapped in one of Walter's old sweaters watching cold November